We continue now at the top of Daf Yud Beis Amud Beis Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 12b. On the previous Amud, the Gemara brought a statement from Rabbi Yochanan. Let's say you have an animal that's owned by two partners, and one of the partners is makdish his half of the animal, and then he goes ahead and he buys the other half of the animal from the other partner, and he's makdish the second half. So in that situation, at the time he was makdish the first half, there was dichoy. It was pushed off from the outset from being able to be a carbon because it was only half of the animal that was consecrated, and so therefore we see from Rabbi Yochanan that there's this concept of dichoy. And the Gemara now continues and says, Yesh dichoy bedamim. We also see that there's a concept of dichoy when it comes to damim, when it comes to value. And Rashi explains, Yesh dichoy bedamim, yesh toras dichoy bekedushas damim. Let's say you have a situation where the item was made holy not to be Kadshe Mizbeach, not to be brought in the Mizbeach as a carbon, but it was sanctified for its value, that its value would be donated to the Beis HaMikdash. There's a concept of dichoy over there as well. Afal pi she'ena kedushas haguf, even though it's not kedushas haguf. Kegon hacha shehikdash chetzi lokit shela ledameh, here, where half of it was sanctified, it was really sanctified for its value. Sharei ein lo chelek ala v'chetzi, because he really only had a portion in half of it. He only had ownership of half of it. Vein kedusha ru'uya lifshot bekula al piv, so therefore the kedusha couldn't spread throughout the whole animal through him consecrating the animal. And nevertheless, there was a concept of dichoy that it was pushed off and it's not kosher anymore for the mizbeach at all. It's completely pushed off. We don't say lo alima kedushas damim lipasel misham dichoy. We don't say that kedushas damim is not strong enough to disqualify it because of dichoy. No, even in a situation of damim, even in a situation of kedushas damim, of kedusha of value, still you can have the concept of dichoy. And the Gemara continues, Amar Ula, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Ula says that Rabbi Yochanan says, Achal chaylev, let's say a person eats chaylev, he eats forbidden fat, v'hifresh carbon, and he separates a carbon in order to bring a carbon for that avera. V'hemer das, but then he becomes an apostate, he's not able to bring a carbon. V'chazarbo, but then he retracts from that, he does teshuva. Hoel v'nidcha yidcha, since he was already pushed off from bringing the carbon, he's completely pushed off, he cannot bring that carbon. Itmar Namni was stated as well, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Amar Rabbi Avo, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yirmiyah said, that Rabbi Avo said, that Rabbi Yochanan said, Achal chaylev, if a person ate chaylev, v'hifresh carbon, he separates a carbon, he separates an animal and consecrates it as a carbon, v'nishtat, and he becomes an imbecile, he becomes a shota, so he's not able to bring the carbon, v'chazar v'nishtafa, but then he heals, hoel v'nidcha yidcha, once he's pushed off, he's pushed off. And the Gemara says, Utsrichi, and we need both teachings of Rabbi Yochanan, even though they essentially seem to be the same thing. The Yashminim Kamaisa, because if we just had the first one where the person became an apostate, so Mishum Dehu Dachi Nafshi Biyadayim, there he actively pushed himself off. He did it to himself. Aval Hacha, but over here in a situation where he became a Shota, the Memela Idchi, where it happened automatically, it wasn't through his action. So Kiyashin Dami, maybe he's no different than someone who falls asleep. You don't say that when someone falls asleep after they've consecrated an animal for a carbon, that the carbon is pushed off. So you might have said that, and so it's teaching us we don't say that. V'yashminan, if it only taught us Hacha over here, if it only taught us the case of the Shota, Misham De'ein B'yado Lachzor, it's not in his capability to return to heal himself. It's something that's going to happen automatically one way or the other. Aval Hacha, but over here in a situation again where he's Hamer Das, where he rejects the religion, the Yesh B'yado Lachzor, it's in his capability to do Teshuvah. So Ein Malo, I would say the halacha is not the same. So Tzricha, it's necessary to teach it in both cases. And the Gemara continues, Boy Rabbi Yirmiyah asks, Achal chaylev, let's say a person eats chaylev, v'hivrish carbon, he separates a carbon, v'horu bezdin, shechaylev mutter, and then bezdin issues a ruling, the chaylev is mutter, it's permitted, and so there's no need for the carbon essentially is pushed off. V'chazru ben, but then they retract their ruling, and so now there is a need for the carbon. Mahu, what would be the halach in that case? Mi have a dichoy, o lo have a dichoy, is that considered pushed off or not? Amar le'ahu Saba, a certain elder said to him, Ki pasach Rabbi Yochanan b'dichuyin, when Rabbi Yochanan would introduce the topic of dichoy, meha pasach, he actually started from this kind of a case. My time, what's the reason? Because hasam gavre idchi, because there in those other cases, it was the person that was pushed off. Carbon lo idchi, it wasn't the carbon that was pushed off. So this is a case that better stresses this idea, because hacha over here, carbon nami idchi, the carbon itself has also been pushed off. Rashi explains, meha pasach, he would introduce it from this case, v'doresh bo sheyidchen, he darshaned that in fact it is pushed off, because hasam over there, gabe mumor v'shota, by the case of the meshumad and the shota, by the case of the apostate and the imbecile, gavre chazra idchi mi carbon. The person was pushed off from the carbon, but carbon lo idchi, but the carbon wasn't pushed off. Torah's chatas zos lo nidachas mi Yisrael min aksherin. The idea, the law of this chatas wasn't pushed off from Klal Yisrael. Aval hacha Torah's carbon zen nidchas min akol. Here, the entire concept of the carbon was pushed off because they ruled the chaylev was mutter, so he would introduce this case as it was a more classic case of dichoy. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Amar Shimon ben Azai said, Mekublani mi pishivim ushnayim zakin v'chulu. I have a tradition from 72 elders. And again, the tradition was that all karbanos that are eaten, if they're brought shalol lishmo, they are kosher with the exception of the carbon chatas and the carbon pesach, which are totally disqualified if they're brought shalol lishmon. And the idea of the tradition is that ola, which is not an eaten carbon, that also is totally disqualified if it's shalol lishma. And the Gemara says, Lamali lamisna shivim ushnayim zakin. Why does it say shivim ushnayim zakin? It says zakin in singular, 72 elders. Tekulu b'chodesh shitasa havakaimi. The idea is that they all agreed with this opinion. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Lahosa ben Azai el ha'ola. Ben Azai was adding the carbon ola, that is completely disqualified if it's shalol lishma. And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Huna says, my time of the Ben Azai. What's the reason of Ben Azai? Because the pasuk says ola hu. It says it is an ola ishe reach nichoach laHashem, and we understand from that pasuk he lishma kasheira shalol lishma psula. When it says ola hu, it means that if it's lishma, then it's kasheira. If it's shalol lishma, then it's disqualified. Essentially, it's learned from the pasuk. The Gemara asks, Asham nami ksiv behu, but Asham also it says the word hu, and the Gemara answers as it's mentioned previously, Hahu la'achar haktaras emurim hu dechsiv. That hu was written after the haktaras emurim, the burning of the sacrificial portions on the Mizbeach, and as we said earlier, that's not even required, and so therefore you can't learn anything from that word in the pasuk. The Gemara says, Hainami la'achar haktaras emurim hu dechsiv, but by Ola also, it's written after the haktaras emurim, and the Gemara says to that, Trei hu ksivi, it says the word hu twice, and if it already says it an extra time, so then again we can learn out that it's going to be disqualified shalol lishma. And the Gemara continues, Gabe Asham Nami Trehu Ksivi, but according to that argument, by the carbon Asham also, it says the word hu twice, and so the same limud, the same derivation you have by the Ola, you should have by the Asham. And so the Gemara instead says, Ela ben Azai bekal v'chomer ma'isila. Rather ben Azai, he derives that Ola is disqualified shalol lishma from the following kal v'chomer. U'machatos she'ina kolel. If when it comes to chatos, which is not entirely burned on the mizbeach, shachta shalol lishma psul, and if you slaughter it shalol lishma, it is disqualified. So ola she'ikolel ola, which is totally burned on the mizbeach, lo kol shekain, certainly that should be disqualified if it's shalol lishma. But the Gemara says, ma'la chatos shekain mechaperes, but chatos is unique because it provides atonement. And the Gemara says, Pesach yochiach, well, the carbon Pesach can prove the other way. But ma'la Pesach shekain zmano kavua, but Pesach is also unique because it has a set time. Chatos tochiach, so chatos can prove the other way. V'chazar hadin, and this goes back and forth. Lo roizeh karoizeh, v'lo roizeh karoizeh. This one is not like that one, and that one is not like this one. Hatzad hashavah shaben, the common denominator in both of them, between chatos and between carbon Pesach, is shehin kodshim, that they are karbonos v'shachtan shalol lishman pasol, and if they are slaughtered shalol lishman, it is pasol. Afani avi ola, so too I include the carbonola, shehi kodshim v'shachta shalol lishman psula, it is kodshim, it's a carbon, and if you slaughter shalol lishman, it is disqualified. The Gemara says, Mal atzad hashavah shaben sheyesh ben tzad kares, but there's a tzad kares, there's an element of kares by both the chatos and the carbon Pesach, so maybe we can learn out ola from there. And the Gemara says Ben Azai, and the Gemara will go on to say that Ben Azai does not consider tzad kares to be a refutation. And Rashi explains, Lamali lemisni zaken lisni zakenim. Why does it say zaken in singular? It should say zakenim. And the answer to the Gemara was bechada b'yeshiva achas hayu. They were sitting in one sitting. Yoshvin, they were sitting together. V'kulan hayu kishecha. They were all like one. La'achar aktaras emurim ksiv. And the Gemara then said that the word hu is written after the burning of the emurim. V'leka lemidrashe le'ikuva. You can't say that that's something that's ma'akev, that's absolutely required. De'atzmo shelo huktar emur of kasher, because even if you don't do the burning of the emur and it's kasher, v'hai hu darshinon lemilsa achrisi. And so the hu is for something else. Trehu ksivi, then the Gemara said it says hu twice. V'mein hasheni inyan la'achar aktar, and if you're not going to use the second one for after the burning of the emurim, to aksiv chad, it already says it once, so teneyu inyan la'avodas dam v'lifsol v'shalol lishman, so apply it to the avodos that have to do with the blood, and say that there's a disqualification when it is shalol lishman, again, when it's not for the sake of the carbon. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph.